the radio was a friend of mine. Because on the radio there were programs for children in the 1940s. There was a program every weekday at 5:30 called Jack Armstrong, the All-American Boy, brought to you by Wheaties, Breakfast of Champions.
Please welcome Richard Pearce.
Thank you. Thank you, Enid. And you'll see a picture later on in the slideshow of Enid and her brother Danny Cuthbert and myself, all in the same room at Royal Oak School. When Enid asked me to share some reflections growing up on the observatory, she said, we would like you to tell us what it was like from your point of view when you were 4, 5, and 6. And I've endeavored to do that. I really don't know why you might be interested in some of those aspects of it. And I found myself slipping into more of a historical presentation on Prospect Lake, where I went to school, and so on and so forth. And I was advised that that's not the purpose of tonight, and you're far more knowledgeable than I am in some aspects of Prospect Lake, and certainly more than I am about Royal Oak, even though I was here for a period of time. So I would like to, just before getting going, I'd like to give credit to a number of people who, without whom I wouldn't be wanting to do this. And I think it arose originally with Enid, as many things do. I attended her August gatherings that some of you have been at. And through that, met a number of you. And then there was the opening of the Royal Oak Annex 2 years ago, or so. And Daryl and Enid were there, and we talked. And Daryl had a dream, and he shared that a little. And so the Royal Oak Historical Association informally developed to record oral histories, of which I think we are singularly indebted to this person for having taken that on. Yeah. So I don't know any other historical group who has that legacy now with those oral histories. Some of your relatives are on there, some of you are on there. Before the Royal Oak situation occurred, I met Audrey Barnes, who is here tonight, Winona Pugh, who's husband? Relative?
Not a relative.
Not a relative. No. Same last name?
Same last name.
Oh, there's a story. Okay. And Lori James Derry. And 5 or 6 women, but I think mainly Winona and Audrey and Lori, worked at producing a book that I'm sure you've all seen, and if you haven't, it's a great joy to read. Because it gives a perspective on Prospect Lake, which, when I lived on the hill, and it's hard to see on here, 1940 to 1951, I came in at about the 7th inning in the ball game. In other words, the Prospect Lake developed in the 1890s or so as a resort area, as you probably know, for fishermen and summer camping and hunting. And the electric railroad that ran out to Deep Cove, which still exists today, was thought to be the destination, and it developed. So my recollection is limited. But when I read this and started to look back at aspects of Prospect Lake, which you'll see on my slideshow, I found, which I don't have in my own archives, I found a very fine 1947 picture of Prospect Lake School, built and designed in the same architectural fashion as the Royal Oak School was and as many other schools were during this time, as some of you studied. And I also found, and I remember this, on the observatory, I got a lift up the hill one day from a gentleman who drove an amazingly teardrop-shaped car. And it was Barney Ophir, or Basil. And he had been down to San Francisco and had met Howard Hughes and had learned Howard Hughes's rather secretive government project of countersinking rivets into the surface for airplanes and to allow them to be more aerodynamically efficient. And Howard gave Barney the technique for countersinking these rivets, and that's what he did with his car. And I remember him driving me up to the observatory on this, and I sat on sort of the transom between where the driver was and sort of crouched, and he took me up, and that was singular. So there's some marvelous pictures in here which brought back memories, so I wanted to give credit to that, and to Heather Smith, who provided me with some insights and a great picture that you'll see later on in here, and Ann Allen, who is a photo archivist in the Prospect Lake area, has an enormous studio with volumes of historical pictures. And she took all of my pictures and put them in sequences for me, also for another project. And Peter Goddard gave me a couple of pictures that I'm using. And mentioned in the program are those individuals that I knew as a 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old boy: Douglas Rose, Douglas Gate, Grant Sheldrick, and eventually Enid and Danny Cuthbert. So, Darrell says, if you make a mistake or you flub up, just pause, because he'll edit all that out.
Or not.
Or not. Yeah, that's right. So, we're looking northwest in that photo, and you can recognize, obviously, the Dominion Astrophysical Observatory. And you'll see on the left-hand side of the photo the West Saanich Road that proceeds along there. And then you'll see some fields not far from where the Red Barn is at this point, and then out toward Heel's Rifle Range, and eventually out to the area where Bouchard's Gardens is. And there's Brentwood Bay, and you can see the island stretching to the left. So that's looking northwest, and you'll notice that in the hill there's a very dense forest on the northeast side and also on the south side, but on the southeast side there's a lot of barren rock, and many years ago that was one of the fires that burned off part of the property of the observatory during the 1940s when I was there. This is all a modern complex now, and there are many federal departments that are operating there with geophysics and earth sciences, as well as some of the astronomical work. And this is a tower here which is used to what's called figure and configure mirrors to a particular specification, and a number of other buildings. And this is the new office building that surrounds, you can see a red roof structure there. That's the old office building, and so they built this new structure around it instead of destroying the old one. They have two buildings now. And here's the dome, and that's where the director's residence was. That's where I lived for those 11 years. And the road, 1.5 miles down to West Saanich Road. Okay, so let's have a look here. If we look southeast, you can see the Observatory Hill, and then you can see Elk Lake. And behind Elk Lake is Mount Douglas, and then over to the right, a little obliterated by the photo, is Mount Tommy. There on the right-hand side is the burned off part of the hill. It was so severe that the government enlisted the support of a platoon of Army men who lived on the hill and in encampment for a week in trying to keep ahead of any of the other fires. And I never learned whether they were set on purpose. It happened to be a very warm set of months in the summer when this occurred, but it certainly threatened the observatory, as you can imagine. And there is, again, all of the no timber here on the side. You can, some of you car gentlemen can probably tell what year that car was, but that's about a 1940 or so shot. And on the left is the director's residence, and my backyard, excuse me, here, my backyard was here. That's the water tower that you were forbidden to climb up, but I put my initials on the top of it several times. And I was such a fool, because the ladders to go up here were crisscrossed metal, and you put your feet within these metal things, and nothing to hang on to but this. And, you know, fools. This is the garage, and then the engineer's house was there. He was the instrument maker. He was the only other living being on the hill on a 24-hour basis other than my family who lived there. And this is the office building down here. And it's important that you sort of have a little background of this, because my life had 450 acres of forest, which I became fairly intimately connected with, both flora and fauna during the years, and a backyard here, which eventually had a playhouse and a few other things. That's what the fire left at the bottom of the hill. So you can see the scarring of the trees and how barren it is. And those are the original gates and so on. If you go out today, about 3 weeks ago, Sylvia and I drove out West Saanich Road, and we took a few shots. The gates are gone. There's a little podium a little further up the road, and on the left-hand side there's some fences. And it's rather uninteresting at the base. There's some tanks of probably fluid or propane or water tanks at the bottom, and there's some work going on. I have no idea what's going on. I haven't been down on the hill for this. But there is the beginning of a trail which goes up to the top of the observatory by the office building. This trail was actually built by the Army, who was there because they needed to get up and down and go through the forest and so on. And I used that trail every day I went to school, coming down the hill on that trail, catching the West Saanich bus when I went backwards and forwards. So, and when I came home from Prospect Lake School or Royal Lake School, I started at that trail. Now, in 1947, my father, we lost our mother when I was 9 in 1945, and he married a wonderful woman in 1947, an alpine climber, 17 years younger than he was. He was in his mid-50s, and he was climbing Mount Rainier one day, and because he participated in the Alpine Club of Canada, and he was on Mount Rainier and Mount Baker, and he was at the top of the hill, and the story he tells me is that he had far too much to carry, and he was out of breath, and he was in not very good shape. And up the hill comes this woman striding along, and she asked him how he was, and from her pack she took an orange, and she gave him that orange, and he married her a year and a half later. She was a bacteriologist in the second war, after the Second World War, in Vancouver, head of the lab there provincially, a fine alpinist, a good botanist, and she taught me from the age of 10 or 12, she taught me many, many, many things. How to shuck oysters, how to eat off the beach, how to be able to take a bee sting out of yourself, how to wash your clothes, all the things that a kid would need to have when eventually he leaves home. So that's the observatory part of it. Now, because of the fires, we had a pump on the top of the hill, and there you'll see like a fire hose, and it was always connected for months and months afterwards. And here are some of the workmen with this hose, and you can see it's fairly powerful spray from that. And there's a car on the left-hand side in the shadows. You can just see the headlights parked under there, and I have no idea what that was. But here is the federal government's pride and joy. This is the Dominion Astrophysical Observatory. There was an observatory being built in Ottawa at that time, a 72-inch, just like this one. But this observatory was placed in Victoria for 3 reasons. The climate throughout the year was very moderate, so the engineering grease and oil and gears could work in winter and summer. Very seldom ever froze. Secondly, the skies were very clear. There was lots of good weather in those days, and there was very little light from Victoria. It was a town, at the time it was done, of about 40,000 people, and then 60,000 people and so on. So there was not much city light. Since then, all those things have, of course, deteriorated. The instrument maker, Mr. Sidney Girling, is on the right. He was a kindly gentleman who made me a U-bow, which was a marvelous thing to add to my Indian costume. And we went catfishing. He took me to Beaver Lake. And on the south side of Beaver Lake, if you go up the west side from the south where the old reservoirs were and the ponds, you can go up there. There's a set of rocks, and we used to go and fish off the rocks. So he would cut a piece of spirea and put a string on it, and then put a little float so that the float would sit in the water, and then down below would be the hook. And of course, when the catfish took the bait, the float would sink. And that was the time you had to strike fish to get the hook in. So we used to take home anywhere from a dozen to 20 catfish, and he used them in his garden. And he grew the most wonderful carrots. And I learned about recycling. We caught the occasional sunfish, but he was like an uncle, because my father was very busy, and Mr. Girling eventually got married and had a wonderful Mrs. Girling, English, wonderful lady. And the Girling family was known in Victoria, and you probably know some of the Girling situations, which I have long forgotten. Andrew McKellar was one of the directors of the observatory later on. He was on that. Now, the war was on. There was a threat from Japan, and the government thought they should camouflage the observatory. So I don't know how many of you have ever seen the observatory, which is artistically painted, has scaffolding all the way around. You could see it for miles. Yes. And that was the time when, some of you may remember, we had air raid wardens in neighborhoods. How many of you? Yeah, right. And my father was one in Victoria, and there was a helmet, and it said Air Raid Warden, Air WR, or something like that, W. And we had to close our curtains at night for the light. And those of you with cars, do you remember? There was a black paper disc that went on the headlight, except for a slit that was there and poked it down. Those were the days when there was ration books. My mother had a ration book, and she also she shopped at Spencer's, which turned into Eaton's, and she had at Spencer's an account, which meant that she could go in and order food, and they wrote it all up, and at the end of the month you paid. And she had what's called a coin number. Does anyone know what a coin number was? It's the number of your account, but it's on a small metal oval disc. And her number was 8417, and I have the disc. And it was where you could get chocolate malts in the basement of the... Do you remember that? And there was a causeway between the streets that was tiled near the meat counter and so on. A chocolate malt. I must have gone to heaven 3,000 or 4,000 or 5,000 times having one of those. It was just marvelous. The minister didn't think much of my choice. My father not only directed the observatory, but he had a great respect for physical work. And these are the workmen. Joe Doby, with a metal leg, sitting there with a great grin in the front. Harry Dukeman, who built a lot of our pools and did a lot of plumbing and hydro work with water. Mr. Chatters at the back, he was an English gentleman, he was the custodian. of the office building, Charlie Sansbury at the back there, and he had a trucking company eventually that was on Blenkinsop, and then Roy Bennett and my dad. So he would invite them to come maybe once in the summer every month and have an afternoon. And those are the men that were very kind to me, and I'm grateful for that. Now, in addition to the workmen, there were astronomers and their wives, and in those days it was a 9-mile drive from Victoria, and therefore coming out to the hill, you came out in the day, carpooled it, then you went home at 5 o'clock, except for the director who stayed at the director's residence, and my father. So here are a number of the people. At this time, here is Richard with his Cub Scout. And we're going to see Peter's father a little later on as the Cub Master. And my sister, who was 17 years older than I was, so here she is here now in her mid-20s. She was at the University of Washington. Then she went on to other academic work. She only came home in the summers. I didn't know her really as a sibling at all. She was somebody like an aunt that came home and looked after things. And my father, and I'll just want to give a little mention. The observatory was built for the reasons that I mentioned, but the work that the observatory was doing was on the forefront of astronomical knowledge at this time. And a man by the name of Hubble in California had in the 1920s clarified that there were large nebulous areas in the sky that were not within our galaxy, but were located way away because of a certain technique which we learned. And the idea was that the ones that they could see, like Andromeda, had the appearance that there was motion in the galaxy. So the question was, did our galaxy rotate? Did it have a motion as a spiral galaxy? There's a whole classification of galaxies, and we are a spiral. The work at the observatory was to try to determine whether that was the case. So basically, what you do is you pick a whole group of different stars, and you take the light from the star, which you put into what's called a diffraction grating, into a spectrum, and you look at the wavelengths. And that will tell you whether the star is moving away from you, like a redshift eventually, or whether it's approaching you. So then you make a three-dimensional map of all of this over a period of time. It takes months to get this kind of data from one star. And that micrometer is like a microscope, but that measures very carefully the information you need. So my father, coming from Ontario, and you'll see it in a moment, he went to work at the Mount Wilson Observatory, where Hodge and Hoyle and a number of other astronomers were, and gained that knowledge, and Canada then appointed him to Victoria here. So he led the astronomy for this. And in about 1928, under Dr. Plaskett, who was the original director, they determined that the galaxy did have a rotation of about 235 million years it takes to go around. And that was a major thing. My father was given that credit with other people at the observatory. And eventually he became president of not only the Royal Astronomical Society, but he became president of the Royal Society of Canada during the years of 46 and 47. So he had a wonderful career. So here is my dad back in Ottawa in about 1920 with my sister, who was 3, and my mother, Esther Edith Mott, the daughter of a country doctor from Mount Pleasant, Ontario. And this trio then moved west to California for 2 years. He finished his work, the PhD was done and everything, and then he was appointed to Victoria. Here is my father and mother in 1940 with my sister now growing up at the University of Washington, and with Richard here at 3.5. So you see there's this sort of reflection of, and so my father and mother lived at 53 Wellington Avenue in Victoria, just off Dallas Road. And when my father was appointed the director of the observatory, we moved to the hill. That's when we came out to Royal Oak in 1940. So and that wasn't our dog, that was a collie up the street that my sister just was very in love with all the time, but it wasn't ours. And so I moved not knowing what was ahead. I was taken from Wellington Avenue to the director's residence on a 752-foot mountain, Observatory Hill. And these are big California redwoods, and I can tell you that I climbed each of them, and I can tell you that it's even worse trying to see out at the top because it's denser than it is at the bottom. And it's easy to climb. There's nice branches and so on and so forth. Again, strictly forbidden. Okay. But if you remember, there were winters. And we still had to go up and down the hill. So I remember one night, my dad was at a meeting in town, and it was after Elizabeth came to live with us, Betty. I must have been 14. And they picked me up from, I think I was at Scouts that night with Mr. Goddard. And they picked me up, and we couldn't get the car up the hill. So we had to park the car at the base of the hill, and there was all the snow. And Betty, without any second thoughts, walked the 1.5 miles up with 16 inches of snow in open-toed shoes. And when we got to the top, we had hot chocolate, and it was a wonderful thing. We thought we'd climb Mount Everest, you know. And so those are some memories that I had of the winter. Well, here is Richard just before he's going to, he's probably in grade 1, but on the hill, he's surrounded by adults. There's no socialization, no children whatsoever, and school was quite a different experience for me. So there's the dome in the background, and I don't have to tell you who's in there, mother and father and a visiting astronomer and her daughter, and Mr. Welburn, who ran the deer home, McMillan Blodell, sawmill in Deerholm up in, he was a great friend. They were both stamp collectors in their avocational stuff. So here we are at Prospect Lake, and this is Division 2, Prospect Lake, and this is the spring of 1943. I was homeschooled for 6 months because my birthday's in February and they wouldn't let me go to school. In September I had to wait and so on. And so I don't know. Today, I can't recognize anyone that's in that picture, but maybe some of you can. And Daryl, I think you have a copy of that. If you don't, I have the original, but I think.
And which one is you?
And here am I. Now, you look at the pinafore, the short pants, and we'll go back to there. Okay? I was driven to school in a Terraplane Hudson in the morning, and I was picked up after school with the same car. I did not play well. I didn't know how to do that. I wasn't from the farm communities, nor did I walk home with them and do the natural kinds of things that you do when you grow up. So that was indeed an unusual and difficult adjustment for me. Here's grade 2, and anybody in that picture, grade 2?
Yeah. I can see it, Richard and Doug Rose right next to you, and Ted Bolton.
Good. So,
Ronnie.
So Doug, here am I. This is.
That's Doug Rose.
That's Dougie Rose. And I talked to him just a week ago, and this is what's named Sylvia. Her name was Sylvia Bird, now it's Rose, right? So that's Dougie Rose and
Ted Bolton.
Ted Bolton.
Ron McCullough.
So there's Dougie Rose, Douglas Rose on my left. Yeah. Douglas Rose lived in 4 different homes around the base of the Observatory Hill during the time before I was there, after I was there. And they lived in one house which was at the base of the hill. That property was where there was a pump house that pumped water from one of the streams near Interurban up the hill to the top of the reservoirs where you saw the water tower. So Douglas Rose was one of the first people, boys, chums, who walked up the hill. And Doug Gate lived on the east side. The Boltons, the three of them, lived next door. And I think the Boltons might have had some sheep at one time. I may not.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so Ted, Lauren, and Elaine, and Doug. And those are my only memories of peers that came up and down. And it wasn't many times, but it happened a couple times. And Douglas Rose, their family, if he was here, I know he would allow me to tell you this, but the family struggled with livelihood. And there was a family by the name of Weldon who had a home in Victoria off of Quadra Street School by Caledonia. Okay? And I think the Palm Dairies used to be very close to Quadra and Caledonia in the old days. And I went in to visit the Weldons and to see Dougie. And I stayed overnight in their home there and so on. And I sensed that my home, with what you'll see, was very different than Dougie's. And I was struck by that. We never talked about it. Kids don't sort of do that, I guess. But in retrospect, I did. And I will tell you personally that when I went to Shawnigan Lake School and we were taught how to say prayers in the Anglican Church, I was in the choir and so on, and when the bishop or somebody would be going on, telling stories that you had to try to understand the metaphor, which I did later, but not then, I would say to myself, well, I better have some prayers. And so the Roses were one of the 6 families in my prayers since I was 10 years old. So they've always been there. And the Roses and the Weldons, because they looked after the Roses. So isn't it strange how you pick things up from the past and you hold them dear, and you just believe, that they were doing some good. Any guesses? Sure. Prospect Lake School. And I was surprised. Prospect Lake Store. And I was surprised to learn from reading the Prospect Lake Reflections book that the store was built about 1912, and you'll know some of the people involved. But that was about the year that the road was started up the observatory hill, and during 13 and 14 and 15 and 16, we have shots of them pulling up the polar axis and the 6-ton mirror and getting the observatory built. Finished in 1916, telescope fully operational in 1918, but 1916 was sort of the year on the floor of the dome and tile. It's still there that when it was built. So there's a picture close to its early years, and somebody can probably identify that machine at the back. So that's a historical picture. Now it's called what? Tia's Heritage Cafe?
Changed hands and name, and I think they're going to call it the Heritage Bistro now.
Oh, I see. Good. Not Starbucks. Okay. This is, Ann Allen gave me this because I was telling her about swimming in Prospect Lake, and she said, well, here's a shot of a log that was eventually incorporated into a float in Prospect Lake. There it is. And it was a place where you could go down the chute and you could dive off. So we used to do that. So here's Prospect Lake. And from the hill, I always thought it looked like an eagle with its head on the right and the 2 wings and the tail on the left. And we went down on the road. I don't know if that was called Echo in those days, but there was a road on the right-hand side all the way down here. And we went down, this is too early a picture, but we went down and swam in Prospect Lake, and the family was called Baswick, I believe. Does that sound familiar? Yes. And Peter Salmon, who swam in the Olympics for Canada, he trained there. His sister was Enid. And before that, I believe, I may be corrected, that that Marilyn Bell swam in the lake and trained for her across. And there was a woman by the name of Florence Chadwick. Okay. Now, back to Richard. I went to school in the daytime, but on the weekends and at home, I was in my own world. And the world consisted of remnants of the Second World War idea. So one of the workmen made me a wooden rifle, which is on my back. My father gave me his satchel from the First World War. He was a signalman in the 58th Battalion during the First World War. And around the other side, there's a big pack sack that you can't see that I was carrying. And I had my father's air raid warden helmet on. And if you look very closely, I mean, I had everything on I could. I had a pair of gloves on. I mean, it's a bright summer day. And I had a pair of rubbers on, a pair of galoshes. And that was my outfit, you see, to go and conquer the world. And so I would ride this tricycle all over the place. The threat from the Japanese was such that the Royal Canadian Air Force enlisted a number of individuals in the area as spotters. Men and women who could take time in shifts and put on a pair of binoculars and track any plane that was up in the air. My mother was a spotter for the RCAF because we had help and she had time and it was la-di-da. And she wore a red blazer, which the hummingbirds loved, and she had a pair of binoculars, and she would spend her shift time, 4 hours, and we had in the breakfast room, we had a wall with all the silhouettes from Mitsubishis and Zeros and Henkels and Messerschmitts because of the Axis, you know, the German. So Japanese, and I learned all these profiles and things of this, kept looking and never saw anything, of course. But the men who were at Patricia Bay and Comox, they were training, and we had the Lancasters here in the Second World War, which were 2-engine bombers. And these guys knew her, Esther, and because she would phone all this stuff in, and they would buzz the hill and waggle the wings and hang out of the plane and wave at her. I thought it was just marvelous. There was an amphibian aircraft. You'll know this more than I think it was called a Catalina flying boat. And then it was a Tanso, was a model of it. And they used to have some old rusty ones in Patricia Bay after the war, which I visited one time and crawled through the fence to review. So this little guy was keeping watch with his rifle for any Japanese aircraft. Yeah. We said, "Do you see any elephants?" No, you know. So here's the story, and oh yeah, I have a report card from Prospect Lake. That's in 1943. Normal progress. The teacher at the end of the year says, "But Richard tends to be a little too talkative at school, you know." So that was. The radio was a friend of mine, because on the radio there were programs for children in the 1940s. There was a program every weekday at 5:30 called Jack Armstrong, the All-American Boy, brought to you by Wheaties, Breakfast of Champions. And then followed Captain Midnight. But on Saturday morning there was a program called Let's Pretend. It was at 7:30 in the morning. I used to get up and listen to the radio. But on Sunday morning, something happened on the radio at CBC at 10 o'clock. 10 o'clock was the time, the official time signal from the Dominion Astrophysical Observatory. The beginning of the long dash marks 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, which was 10 o'clock, you see, our time here. So, you know, beep, 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 and then there was a 10-second pause, and then beep. What was the program that came right after that? Right after 10 o'clock, every Sunday morning? in the 40s, the BC Gardener. 15-minute program on the BC Gardener, which I wasn't interested at all, but at 10:15, just Mary. Now, Mary Gannon worked for the CBC from the 30s on, and she told stories on the radio. Wonderful stories, and I listened all the time. And one of my book collections here is just Mary's stories. Oh, okay? Anybody else got that one? Yeah? Okay, just Mary's stories. And this is June the 11th, 1943 is inside, and here's the story. My father, who was responsible for many things, knew how much I was drawn to these stories. And so he said, why don't you write to just Mary? Why don't you write about your story with your gun? And so I did. And when she was visiting a cross-country tour for CBC, she was interviewed and she was asked what her most interesting experience that she had on her tour. And she said, seeing the moon through a fan letter. So I was the fan letter. So it said, young Richard Pearce, son of blah, 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 was the writer, and he explained how he was watching for Japs along the Pacific coast near his home with his wooden gun, because he knew that if the Japs ever landed, just Mary would have to go off the air. Considering this was quite a compliment, she wrote a story about me, and she titled it, Richard, Corporal of the Mounted Rifles. And she sent it to me, and then she came to Victoria, and she actually met my father, and came to the observatory, and brought me this book, and it says, it's been nice to meet you, Richard, just Mary, June the 11th, 1943. And a little enclosure card to me, and this is book number 7 in my collection. So it's a little story, but it ties in with this little guy. Quickly, I had another friend, a dog called Willie Whitepaws. You can see the 4 white paws and the white chest. And he was a true friend. And there's another story to that, but he was a wonderful dog, and my first dog, and only dog. When visitors arrived at the hill, I had to give off all the good stuff to them to wear, and I ended up with a Royal Canadian Air Force cap, a blue cap and a tiny wooden gun, not very appreciative at all, but I was a gentleman, so you gave all your good stuff to your friends, and we played what was called guns. Again, kids doing that. Now this is me up on one of the ladders looking through the eyepiece for this 72-inch telescope, and this is taken probably around when I was probably 7 or 8. This, I had on it, I'm sorry, the picture's not a good one. I had on an Indian costume. The instrument maker before the Girlings, the name was Hutchison. And Tom Hutchison was the instrument maker, and his wife was a very kindly lady, and she, with a potato sack, dipped, making it brown, sewed me for Halloween at Prospect Lake School. We had a Halloween party. She sewed me an Indian costume, and then she got a whole bunch of feathers and wove you can see the headdress there, and there's the bow that was made earlier than the U-bow. And so here I was with that, and I kept that Indian costume long after I couldn't wear it. It was just one of those childhood mementos that you have on that. Because I was alone so much, my dad felt that reading would sort of be a good thing. So here's Richard reading some of his books. And I began to have a collection. And we still have 86 out of the 100 that I had. So here's Thunderhead, my friend Flicka, Huckleberry Finn, and Tom Sawyer, the A.A. Millen's House on Blue Corner, and so on and so forth. The Just Merry book is there on the left-hand side. And there was a set of Indian stories, of which this is one. And I was a character in these stories, and so my father made a book plate for me. So there's the shelf that has got most of these now, and I really don't know where a couple went, but that's not a bad record for 100. So in every book, and here's this one. Okay, in every book there is this frontispiece, and my father made a bookmark that is just like that in every book, and there's a number. This is number 12. So here is the young brave on the right-hand side, Raven Wing, and his dog. And on the left-hand side is my father, Hawkeye. You notice the little hawk at the top left-hand corner? Okay. And my mother was called Bending Willow, which I thought was wonderful. It's right in the book here. Okay, and then the baby. Now, I've looked at this picture and I've read these stories again. And very interestingly enough, Hawkeye was killed quite early in Raven Wing's life. That wasn't the story my father told me. I don't know if he even read the books, but he read enough. And I think that picture on the left is Hawkeye and Bending Willow and me as a baby. And then this one on the right is Raven Wing growing up. So anyways, that formed part of the reason that my love of books was established and has persisted ever since. Although Wind in the Willows was written just after the turn of the century, you know, and here is the facsimile of a first edition, but a first edition is worth about $700 now. This is a facsimile, but this is Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Grahame. You remember Wind in the Willows? Okay. And a man by the name of such and such has written the wind Beyond the Willows, or The Wind in the Willows and Beyond. It's what happened after these people. And A.A. Milne's books, Winnie the Pooh and so on, came about 20 years later. And so these were all memorable copies. I went to Camp Elphinstone for 3 or 4 or 5 years. My father thought that when I wasn't in school I should be busy, so he shipped me off to Howe Sound by the Lady Rose. You remember the boat? And we all got there and went up there for a week or two. Well, he sent me up there for a month. And so I sort of learned how to swim up there and had an interesting experience. So there I am walking down the street with my lunch and a book. After I left Prospect Lake, it was because my mother was not well. I must have been a handful, and I was put into St. Michael's School in Victoria. So I was still on the hill at night on the weekends, but every week I was a weekly boarder from Monday till Friday. And that was my uniform with the hat. But when you come home after school, you put on so I don't know, you lose, you go from one role to another, you know, and so on and so forth. So this was, my sister came home, my mother died in May in 45. Mother's Day, Sunday, was a, you know, I guess you want to remember it that way. And my sister had been brought home from a position she was at the North Carolina University to look after the family or me and my dad, sort of. So she gave up her job for a while, came home, lived at the observatory, would take me swimming at Prospect Lake. I mean, after all, I was 11 here, and she was something about 28, or no, 11. She was 17 and 8, 25, and so she was wonderful. And she got a position at the University, Victoria College, which was at Craigdarroch Castle in those days. And she would drive the car in. My dad didn't use the car because he was at work all the time down the hill. She drove the car in and dropped me off at Royal Oak School. And I went to Royal Oak School for that particular year, 45, 46. And she took me to Forbidden Plateau. You're skiing, imagine skiing in a Cowichan sweater, you know, completely inundated with snow. But I learned how to ski and still have, and it was a wonderful start to that career. So you're going to recognize this. This is Royal Oak School. And there's an exceptionally handsome guy, fourth from the left on the back row. That's Daryl. And who's on Daryl's right shoulder?
Peter.
That's Peter Goddard. And you'll have to help me out with the rest. This one, I don't know why, but is that Greeny Heel?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Then he had red beside him.
Here's
Yeah.
Ian. So,
Where are you, Shirley?
yeah, so this was 1946.
I think
Yeah, I see.
This was a good year for me. I was out of private school, you know, the St. Michael's, which was a strange environment because I wasn't of a private school background, and many English people that sent their children to St. Michael's were. We didn't live in Oak Bay. Not that there's anything wrong with Oak Bay, but we weren't of that culture. Yeah, watch it, okay. We weren't of that culture. And so I was happier here. The annex was functioning. We used to go tumbling in the annex in the bottom of these with these mats on. You know, we do the tumbling thing. And this was a good year. My sister was home, and it was fine. But at the end of that year, a year after my mother passed away, my sister had a beau that drove his car, Packard, with a rumble seat, up from Miami, where he was, and they got married in August at the Christchurch Cathedral in 1946. My father decided, because he was president of the Royal Society, that he would go to Europe and lecture, and Richard was placed in Shawnigan Lake School, another transition. So I went to Shawnigan Lake School, a private school again. One of the best things about that is my father had given me a bugle when I was quite young, and I learned how to play the bugle. So of course I was nabbed by the assistant headmaster to play the bugle in the cadets for Shawnigan Lake. And I must say that it gave me a little bit of what?
Edge?
Yeah. I mean, it was something no one else did, and I was pleased, and I tried to do it really well, and I joined the choir and all the rest of that stuff. So I was there for 2 years. But at the end of the second year, my father married Elizabeth Betty, the wonderful Alpine person that he met, and they established their house on the hill, I mean, where my home was. And I ran away from Shawnigan Lake School one Sunday afternoon. I mean, you can think about this subconsciously. You know, what was I doing? I was coming home. And I thumbed a ride. I had a friend, and he ran away too. We both got caned for this. The marks lasted for 3 weeks. In the dormitory, after it was all over, we had to stand up and take our drawers down. Everybody, the 6 boys in the ward, would see all these battle wounds, you know. And I thumbed down the Island Highway with John Hall. He was from Seattle. And we didn't have any money. So I begged for some coins on the causeway in front of the Empress Hotel where there are tourists, saying, I have 15 cents and I just need another dime to catch the bus home. And I kept doing that until I had enough money for 2 tickets to the observatory, plus enough for 1 grilled cheese sandwich at the coach line's bus depot. And that was a really good sandwich because we hadn't had anything to eat. So we did that and we came home. Well, we were in this playhouse that I showed you about before, and I guess we were making a bunch of noise, and my stepmother came out and terribly surprised. I mean, what am I doing here? And so we were going to run away, but we couldn't, and so we came back, and we were driven back to the school, and we got caned in the school. But 3 weeks later, my dad took me out of Shawnigan Lake and brought me home. So that's where I came to Royal Oak School again. There I am blowing up from the other shot. And, oh, this is just a little introduction. You saw this before. These are, you know, astronomers and their wives. Well, if astronomers work at night, you wonder how in the world they had families, but they didn't seem to have a problem. There's a book on the counter that says it's something that's Sex Before Dawn or something like that. It's one of these new novels. So this was wonderful. But these were all twins and various people from the famous observatory astronomers who lived there. They had receptions, you see. It was a family, and everybody came on Sunday evenings or Sunday afternoons and had these gatherings. So here's the Cub Scout and in the uniform, and there's Peter's father. Okay. So there's the man that I remember as the Scoutmaster. And this is returning from the summer at Elphinstone. It looks like a Polish immigrant or something like this, you know, coming to Canada. I had so many different sort of changes in my life. I was sort of a no fixed address. I learned how to swim really well. Not only at Camp Elphinstone, but at the Crystal Gardens. You can recognize the old Crystal Gardens? And there was a wonderful man there by the name of Mr. Butterworth, who was the lifeguard. And he really encouraged me. I learned how to dive off the high diving board and so on. So after Shawnigan Lake, I came to the school in May, and this was taken just a few days before, and I would have been in the picture next to Margaret Hurd there. On the left, I guess. But the only person that I wonder about is that Grant Sheldrake. Were you not in that year?
I missed the picture.
Yeah. Yeah. Because there's Danny Cuthbert on the right, and then who's that? The next. Barb Tubman, and then Enid, and then Gracie Chu. And then Bernice, maybe somebody?
Jackson.
Yeah. So, and who's the boy on the right with glasses? Beside Gladys Welch.
Eddie Lorenzo.
Oh, that's right. I thought he was wonderful. We had great chats. And then the rest. Jimmy Vi in the center at the top. Okay, well, you know all these. Now, probably the happiest of all my elementary years is this year. And this was 48, 49, I think. And you can see Danny here, Jimmy Vi, me, here's Grant, Lawrence, Shirley Goyette, Lorraine Looney.
Margie Mon.
Yes, who's this?
Margie Mon.
Oh yeah, Marjorie Vaughn, right, and Margaret Hill. And this is Call's younger sister, Calla Singh. Jaginder or Uganda. Yeah, and so on. And who is this?
Marilyn.
Marilyn?
Simmons, I think.
Simmons.
Marilyn Simmons. Okay. Thank you. What a wonderful group. You have all this memory. Okay, so that's grade 6, and there's Gladys. And then the Wheeler brothers at the top, Pat and Mike. They wore their Cub uniforms often. I sort of wondered whether or not there was, you know, anything else, but they were proud of that, and that was really neat, and it was good. We had a good softball team, I remember that. Now, after school in that year, I usually took the bus home, or my sister, no, I took the bus home, or I walked. So about 3 weeks ago, Sylvia and I drove up West Saanich Road, and I photographed a couple places, and I'd like to tell you my connection with these, and you will certainly have something larger or more significant. This house, which is just a little bit south of where Markham Road cuts off, the man and lady in that day, 48, 49, they were very nice people. And the man was working outside, and I would stop and we'd chat. He says, "Come on in, and I'll show you something." So in his basement there was a pinball machine, and it was a baseball where the plate went around and the ball went and caught first base, second base, and you get a home run and so on. I thought I'd died and gone to heaven. You didn't have to pay, and all these things, you kept going. So I would stop in there almost every week. And he'd say, "Fine, fine." And then I'd be late for dinner, so on and so forth. So I stopped a couple of years ago, actually, and I met the man who was in that house, but he had a big operation of farm stuff going around. He didn't know who it was that was in 48.
You don't remember the name?
No, I don't. And I could go back.
Did they have horses? Teddy and Flo Hawks.
Maybe?
Yeah.
Think so?
Yeah.
Well, I'll write it down. Because Carolyn Duncan said to me, I just have to look up, this. Heather lived, and I didn't bring the copy of her house, which is gorgeous, she sent me. It's just a couple lots up at the corner of Markham and West Saanich Road, just across from where the Scout Hall was, before you go up the hill. Which incidentally, that hill was regraded back in 1915 to get the observatory's polar axis with horse and buggy up. They couldn't make it, so they cut off part of the top of the hill or regraded. It was all gravel in those days. Past St. Michael's of All Angels, on the right-hand side was a driveway. It was the driveway to the Singh farm. And Enid tells me you thought it was a dairy farm, did you?
Yes.
Yeah, I didn't know. I never went up the road. But that's where Calla would disappear, when we would be going home. He worked on that very, very right after school. Do you recognize that place?
Grandma's house. That was open the year I was born.
Was it? And what year do you think that was built?
41. It opened in 42.
42.
And they just celebrated, the guy that built one, they just celebrated his birthday a couple months ago.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, when I was on the hill from 40, I would observe Mr. and Mrs. Chu, that I do, from a distance.
My
Grandparents. There was a wooden building set back off the property.
Yeah.
Where
the
they,
old barn.
there was, I think they lived in that before this house was built.
That's where my mother was born.
Where your mom was born.
In that barn.
Yeah, because Gracie and Nancy came out from this rather modest dwelling, like they'd come out of a magazine. Absolutely crisp and, white. It was just one. And Gracie, I think, was 1 year after me, and Nancy, I think, was 1 year above. I think there's a couple years between the
That
sisters.
picture you showed earlier, that was Sue. That's Sue.
Ah. During these years, my folks, I went where they went. My father and then my sister were good friends of the Maltwoods. And as a 10-year-old boy, I used to go on a Sunday, and I would sit in the living room on a chair with my knees together and a small napkin over my knees and a plate with a teacup and saucer, and try to eat with all of that, and keep everything, and shut your mouth, sort of thing. So I was seen and not heard. Isn't that the expression?
Yes.
But I learned some things about the reverence and appreciation of literature and art. Although I didn't understand a lot of it, it was the attitude that my family had about these things. It was the same way when we went to Butchard's Gardens. My father knew the Butchards. And I remember being allowed to go up and look at the bowling alley in the Butchard property. Couldn't touch a ball. I mean, it was just to look. And her rose garden was a very important thing. So those were the kinds of things that we did that didn't put me in the community. It put me into various places along the community. And it was a different life. So they're lovely plum and cherry blossom in bloom. It was just 3 weeks ago when I think we took that picture. So then, leaving Royal Oak, just to finish off the slides, I went to Quadra Street School. And at Quadra Street School, here is Norm Smith, Heather's husband, and me. So there's Norm. And when I told Heather several years ago that I had gone to Quadra, she went home from one of the meetings and said to Norm, you know, da-da-da-da-da-da. And he said, well, there was a kid called Dickie Pearce that used to be at the observatory. You know, she still calls me Dickie. And so this was me, and this was Norm. Now, to tell the story, Norm colored his photograph with a red bow tie. And the reason he did that was that, boy, he was sweet on Lorraine Wright, who is right here, this doll. And she had red shoes on. He painted the shoes red, but it doesn't show up
You
there.
weren't supposed to tell that.
Oh, well, I'll phone him up and apologize. Because I was sweet. My first girlfriend was Marilyn Thomas, who is now Marilyn Thomas Cummings and is in Ontario. And Marilyn and I sat behind her in grade 7, and we got to be friendly, and my father invited her to the hill one afternoon, and then we were able to go to the Crystal Gardens together and swim, and she's a good swimmer. And I will tell you, I haven't told this for a long time, but I was a good swimmer, so I dove off the side of the pool and came up. So she followed, but she chipped her incisor, 45-degree angle on 2-1, the dentist would call it here, and I just thought the world had ended, because I thought, how in the world is she going to live with a chipped tooth? So she went home, and Mr. Thomas, her father, he ran a garage very close to the roundabout where Douglas and Government come together. There was a BA station, I think, there, and Thomas, that's who he was. He wasn't home, but her mother was home, and her mother, I saw it really hurt that this had happened, but she was very fair about it, and it was okay, and so on and so forth. So that was sort of the love and tragedy of grade 7. I went on from bugle to playing tuba in S.J. Willis, and studied under Howard DeNike, and because my friend Dennis Tupman played clarinet, I switched over to play clarinet, and eventually we played in the festivals in Victoria. The boy on the far right is Kenny Walters, and believe it or not, he lives in Ladner, and when I'm in Tawasin, not far from there, he's taken several of the courses that I've been teaching for Elder College in the last 10 years. And he's 2 years younger than I am. And he didn't have his picture in his library, so he's absolutely delighted to be able to have that picture. I joined the Canadian Scottish Regiment in high school, played tuba for them, and then clarinet, and so on. And so this guy grew up, and so he left Royal Oak, left Prospect Lake, and lived at 1233 Union Avenue. And we moved in there in July 1951 after the year at S.J. Willis. So I was still on the hill through all of S.J. Willis. And I'm sure that you, just like me, have collected your pictures. And there I'm at Mount View High School in grade 10 with Art Walker on the right, who's the president of the Alumni Association and has organized reunions and so on. There's a whole bunch of people there, and my time is up. So we'll go to one more. There's grade 11, and I can name you everybody in there. Ernest Livesey, a great chemistry teacher, and square dance teacher as well. And there's grade 12. Now, these people here are just one of 2 groups. Okay, Mount View High School had 2 classes of grade 12s. This was 1955, ladies and gentlemen. And this is 2005. 50 years later. And you had this gentleman come to speak here a few years ago, Ron Burnham.
Yeah.
Because he went to Strawberry Vale, I think. You remember that, Grant? So here's Ron Burnham and Robin Knudsen, who is a veterinarian, international now doing project work, yours truly, and Gary Freer and Jones and Dave Phillips, who lives, I think, up in Port Alberta. And here's Art Walker, who kept this group going. Janine Graves at the time, Marlene Matthews, who's now, of course, changed the name. And this was Donna Finch. And her brother, Lance Finch, became a Supreme Court justice. Lived on the island here. So it was great to see those people in 2005. And after 3 years at Mount View, that was the group of people, I guess, that I got to sort of hang out with. And so there's 11 years on the hill of this little guy. And I've made mistakes, and I'm sure I've left things out. I hope I thanked most of the people appropriately. There's a whole raft of stories I'd like to tell you, but it's 9 o'clock, and I have some respect for your bottoms sitting in your chairs there. So, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for the invitation to come and be with you. And
Thanks very much for
uh,
coming.